In the remote highlands of Oregon, where the fog clings to the pines like damp shrouds, there stands an abandoned mining settlement few dare to visit. It's a place that history quietly tried to forget, a cluster of cabins and a decrepit dining hall slowly being reclaimed by moss and rot. Locals whisper about what was found there in 1910, long after the gold veins had run dry. A discovery so chilling it forced even the most hardened sheriffs to cross themselves and walk away. Decades earlier, in the booming days of the Oregon Gold Rush, dozens of hopeful men tunneled deep beneath the earth, chasing fortune. They built a simple life on that ridge, hard work, rough humor, and shared meals in a long wooden hall at the end of the day. But one bitter winter, the men simply vanished. No farewell telegrams, no bodies dragged out by wolves. They were just gone. It wasn't until 30 years later that a surveying crew stumbled upon the truth. Inside the old dining hall, 13 miners sat perfectly upright around a long table, plates of petrified stew before them, mugs still raised in silent toasts. Their eyes were hollow sockets, jaws agape in a parody of laughter, skin stretched tight across brittle bones. It was as if they'd been frozen in the middle of a joke, waiting for someone to laugh along. What happened in that hall has haunted generations. Some say it was a curse brought up from the tunnels, others whisper about debts paid in blood to things older than the mines themselves. Over the next hour, I'll take you deeper than any shaft they dug, peeling back the layers of fear, greed, and a darkness that might still linger in the Oregon hills. Stay with me to the end. I promise, once you know what they found in the dirt, and what may have found them, you'll never look at an old wooden table quite the same way again. Hit subscribe, brace yourself, and let's begin. They called it Miller's Ridge, though no one named Miller ever laid claim to it. It was a shallow rise in the otherwise ragged Oregon backcountry, wrapped in skeletal pines and stunted brush. In the spring, the slopes burst with violet lupins and blood-red Indian paintbrush. But by autumn, the flowers shriveled, leaving only brittle stems that rattled in the wind like dry bones. In 1879, a company of 32 men hauled wagons up that ridge with a promise scrawled on scrap paper: richest gold seen this side of the Rockies. They were miners mostly, but also drifters, failed farmers, and men running from warrants or wives. Hope burned hotter than any hearth. They pitched canvas tents and built rough cabins from pine logs, hammering boards by lantern light. When the winter set in, they scraped together a long dining hall from warped planks and leftover beams. That hall became the heart of their little world, a place to thaw frostbitten hands, tell filthy jokes, sing war songs off-key, and dream of wives who had probably long stopped waiting. Among them was a man named Ephraim Tully. He'd fought under Sherman, lost 2 fingers at Bentonville, and wore a grim sort of smile that never quite reached his eyes. Tully didn't come to Oregon for gold, not really. He came for distance. From what, no one knew and no one dared ask. What they did know was that Tully carried an old tin locket. Some nights, after the others were 3 or 4 mugs deep, he'd pop it open, stare at the tiny daguerreotype inside, and mutter apologies to someone only he could see. It was Tully who found the first sign that something in Miller's Ridge might be off. Late one evening, he staggered back from the treeline with a brace of rabbits, eager to impress the camp cook, and saw strange marks etched into the dirt outside the dining hall. Circles within circles, linked by crude lines that crisscrossed like spider webs. At first, he thought one of the boys had been whittling drunk designs into the ground. But the grooves were too wide, as if scooped by clawed hands. And in the center of each circle lay small mounds of ash. He cursed under his breath, scattered the mounds with his boot, and hauled the rabbits inside. When he told the others, they laughed it off. Probably a prank. Or kids from some nearby native camp trying to scare them off. Only the cook, a wiry man with a stained apron named Jesper, seemed troubled. That night, Jesper burned sage in the corners of the hall, muttering half-remembered Catholic prayers. Winter deepened. Snow piled up against the cabins, sealing men inside for days. The mine tunnels grew damp and treacherous, with wooden beams groaning under invisible pressures. Some mornings, the men would emerge from their bunks to find fine black dust settled over everything. Their blankets, their beards, even the stew left on the stove overnight. Jesper said it was cold dust from the lanterns. Tully wasn't so sure. Then came the knocking. Soft at first, almost playful, like a child rapping at a bedroom door. It would come at all hours, on the walls of the dining hall, on the window frames of bunkhouses, even on the trunks of trees when a man stepped out to relieve himself. Always 3 knocks, then silence. When someone finally flung open a door mid-rap, shotgun leveled, there was nothing there but swirling snow. By late January, men began complaining of dreams. Vivid, crawling things. of being watched by hollow eyes that hovered just beyond the reach of lantern light, of long tables set with rotting food, where they were guests of honor, but when they looked down their own hands were skeletal, and their voices croaked out dust instead of words. Still the promise of gold kept them there. Even when one miner, young Lawrence Burke, wandered off into the trees one night and was found days later hanging upside down from a pine, throat cut so deeply his head lolled against his chest. They told themselves it was an accident, or maybe he'd gone mad from isolation. They buried him at dawn, the frost so hard they had to use pickaxes just to break ground. Ephraim Tully didn't sleep at all after that. He sat up in the dining hall each night with a lantern, his locket clutched tight in his good hand, repeating the same hushed phrase over and over, "Not here, not for me." It was on one such night, deep in February with wind howling through the cracks, that he saw them. Figures standing just beyond the frost-caked windows. Too many to count. Tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch and bend wrong, faces featureless save for wide, hungry mouths. When he blinked they were gone. But the snow outside bore dozens of prints, long, three-toed impressions that sank deep as if whatever made them was heavier than a man. He tried to rouse the camp at first light, urging them to pack up and leave. But gold is a poison that numbs even the sharpest instincts. They mocked him, saying he'd been dipping too deep into the cooking whiskey. Tully spat in the snow and swore he'd see them all dead before spring. 3 nights later he vanished. Jesper found the locket on the dining hall table, open to reveal that same haunting daguerreotype. Only now the face in the image was blurred, twisted, as if the photograph itself had rotted. In the days that followed Tully's disappearance, an uneasy quiet settled over Miller's Ridge. The men still rose at dawn, shoulders hunched against the biting cold, still trudged into the mouth of the mine, picks and hammers slung across their backs. But their laughter was hollow now, and more than once a miner would pause mid-swing, head cocked, as if listening to whispers echoing from the deepest shafts. Jesper, the cook, began to leave bowls of broth out on the back stoop of the hall. He claimed it was for stray dogs. But everyone knew there hadn't been dogs around since autumn. When pressed he'd only mutter, "Better fed than angered." Then one evening the miners returned from the tunnels to find dozens of small stone piles built around the perimeter of the camp, careful stacks of 3, always 3, capped with lumps of soot-stained ice. No tracks led to or from them. Jesper wept when he saw it, mumbling rosaries with trembling hands. Some of the others laughed nervously, kicking the stones apart, trying to drown their fear in bravado. But that night the knocking returned, louder than before, echoing through the beams of the dining hall so forcefully that plaster dust fell into their stew. No one slept. Lanterns burned all through the dark hours, flames dancing wildly as if buffeted by invisible breaths. Men sat huddled at the long table, hands curled around tin mugs, eyes darting to the door every time the wind moaned. At one point, Jesper stood abruptly and began nailing iron spikes into the doorframe. When asked why, he only said, "Iron keeps them out." But he couldn't explain who they were. By the next morning, 3 men had packed their things and started down the trail to town. Their names were Henry Cole, Jacob Lund, and a quiet Welshman called Griff. The others watched them disappear into the pines, secretly envying their courage, or perhaps it was simply the desperate hope that sending them away would appease whatever unseen forces circled Miller's Ridge. They never made it to town. A search party went out 2 days later after no word came from the trading post. They found the bodies less than a mile from camp, frozen upright in the snow, faces contorted in rictus grins, eyes wide and glassy. Their hands were clasped around their bellies as if trying to hold something inside. When one of the searchers pried Cole's arms apart, a shower of black dust poured from his mouth, spilling across the snow like spilled ink. Jesper collapsed to his knees and began to keen, rocking back and forth. The others stood paralyzed, unable to comprehend the horror before them. Finally, one man broke the silence with a single hoarse sentence that none would ever forget. "It's in us now." From that moment on, the camp was gripped by a hush deeper than any snowfall. Men stopped singing at night. They walked in pairs, always glancing over their shoulders. A few carved crude talismans from juniper wood, hanging them over their bunks or slipping them into shirt pockets. Jesper sprinkled salt and lines across the thresholds and refused to let anyone cross them without first dipping a hand into a bowl of ash. But despite every superstition, every frantic ritual, they could not keep out the dreams. Each night brought darker visions. Great cavernous rooms lit by candles made of something that was not wax, long banquets of raw meat crawling with flies, and always, those figures with gaping mouths and eyeless sockets, beckoning them to sit and feast. When morning came, the men woke drenched in sweat, tongues blackened, stomachs cramping with a gnawing hunger that stew and bread could no longer satisfy. Jesper tried to keep them fed, boiling pot after pot of thin broth, but it did nothing to quiet the rumbling within them. It was around this time that the knocking stopped. At first they rejoiced, thinking perhaps the nightmare had ended. But then they realized the silence was far worse. For without the knocking, there was nothing to warn them when the figures stood at the edge of the treeline, watching. Sometimes, after a particularly long day in the shafts, a man would look up from his plate and swear he saw one of them standing just inside the door, as if it had always been there. By the time he blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the scent of damp earth and rot hanging in the air. And so, even though the gold veins were still rich, the miners began to whisper about leaving come spring. Just a few more weeks, they told themselves. Enough to fill their pockets and buy passage somewhere warm, somewhere crowded, somewhere that laughter didn't echo so strangely against the walls. But deep down they all feared it was already too late. That Miller's Ridge had marked them, hollowed them out from the inside. And that whatever was waiting at the edge of their lantern light would not be satisfied until it had drawn every last one of them to the long silent table it kept prepared. The last snowfall came heavy and wet, blanketing Miller's Ridge under a crushing silence. It muffled every sound, the groan of old timbers, the curses of tired men, the shovels biting into frozen dirt. Even the wind seemed afraid to howl too loudly. When the miners spoke, it was in hushed murmurs that died inches from their lips. Jesper had taken to sleeping in the dining hall itself, surrounded by rings of salt and little iron charms he'd fashioned from discarded nails. Each night he burned a twist of sage and muttered a prayer in a voice that cracked and shook. Few dared mock him anymore. They'd seen enough to understand that a cook's desperate superstitions were better than no defense at all. It was around this time that the dreams began to spill into the daylight. It started subtly. A man might look up from his digging and swear he saw a shape slip behind a support beam, long and black, like a tangle of wet roots pulling itself out of sight. Another would claim to hear laughter echoing down the tunnels, though it sounded thin, like wind passing over empty bottles. More than once, they found little piles of stones stacked neatly along the mine walls, capped by splashes of some dark substance that might have been old blood. Then came the hunger. No matter how much Jesper cooked, the men complained of aching bellies, of a gnawing emptiness that left them weak-kneed and hollow-eyed. They shoveled down stew by the ladle, tore loaves of bread into chunks and swallowed them barely chewed. Yet even as their stomachs bulged, they grew thinner. Cheeks sank, eyes protruded, and skin took on a waxy pallor. Jesper stopped eating altogether, muttering that he'd rather starve than feast on what's been offered. One afternoon, the Welshman Griff, softer than the others, with a kind heart that was always offering to patch boots or carve little toys, collapsed just outside the mine mouth. By the time they got to him, he was clawing at his own belly, blood welling under his fingernails. When they pulled his hands away, they found shallow grooves in his skin, as if he'd tried to tear himself open. He died with a look of profound relief on his face. That night, no one slept. They gathered in the dining hall, every lantern they owned brought inside, the room aglow with trembling flames. Jesper sprinkled more salt, more ash, more whispered pleas to saints that had long ago turned their backs on this place. Outside, the snow glowed faintly in the moonlight, casting back eerie reflections of the men's worried faces. It was then that Sam Doyle, a grizzled miner missing most of his teeth, began to laugh. A hoarse, wheezing cackle that had no humor in it. "Look at us," he spat, flecks of saliva catching the lantern light. Huddled like old women around a sewing circle. Afraid of shadows and ghost stories. No one answered. The only sound was the tick of cooling lantern glass. Doyle stood, rolling his shoulders as if to shake off the fear clinging to him. "I'm done with this. Done with your salt, your mutterings, your fairy tales. Tomorrow I'm going back into that shaft, and I'll haul out enough gold to buy a mansion in Portland. The rest of you can rot up here with your nightmares." He stormed out into the snow, door slamming behind him so hard it rattled dust from the rafters. For a long moment no one moved. Then Jesper sank to his knees, pressing trembling fingers to his lips. "I didn't mark the door," he whispered. "The iron's only on this side." At dawn, when Doyle didn't return, two of the braver men went looking. They found him sitting on a stump just outside the tree line, hat in his lap, eyes wide open and fixed on something none of them could see. His skin was stretched so tight over his bones it looked ready to tear. When they touched his shoulder, the body slumped sideways and crumbled, spilling out clouds of that same fine black dust that seemed to haunt Miller's Ridge. From that point on, the men refused to leave the dining hall at night. They dragged in bedrolls, extra crates, barrels, anything to build barricades against the doors and windows. but it brought little comfort. Some claimed they heard voices whispering right outside the walls. Others said they smelled rot, a sweet, cloying stench like fruit left too long in the sun. Then the tables began to move. It was subtle at first. A mug would be found shifted to the end of the table, though no one recalled placing it there. Then an entire bench was discovered pulled back from its usual spot, as if someone had risen abruptly and forgotten to push it in. Jesper took to marking the edges of the tables with chalk lines at night. Each morning the lines were broken, the furniture slightly rearranged. One morning they woke to find plates neatly set out along the entire length of the hall. 13 plates, each with a small mound of what looked like raw meat. Forks rested beside them, knives gleaming dully. Jesper swept them from the table with a strangled cry, hurling the cutlery into the fireplace. But the next night the plates returned. From then on, the miners avoided the long table entirely, eating instead in corners or standing up, always watching each other from the corners of their eyes. They spoke in whispers if at all, and flinched whenever a board creaked underfoot. Even the air felt different, heavy and damp, carrying faint undertones of mildew and copper. And through it all, the hunger gnawed at them. One man was caught trying to drink lamp oil, convinced it might fill the hole inside. Another was found chewing on the heel of his own boot, tears streaming down his gaunt face as he tried to swallow leather. By the time the last snowfall began to melt, Miller's Ridge was no longer a mining camp. It was a mausoleum in waiting, a place where men clung to life not out of hope, but sheer, quaking terror of what might be waiting for them on the other side. And somewhere deep beneath their feet, in tunnels long since abandoned, something shifted. Stones fell from unseen ledges, landing with wet plops on sodden earth. A breath exhaled from the darkness, long and low, almost content. As if whatever haunted Miller's Ridge was simply biding its time, savoring the slow decay of the men above. Spring arrived at Miller's Ridge with little ceremony. The snow receded grudgingly, revealing mud-slick ground studded with broken branches and the blackened remnants of old campfires. The miners emerged from the dining hall like men crawling out of crypts, pale, sunken-eyed, hands trembling even in the weak sunlight. They tried to resume digging, more out of stubborn habit than hope, though the gold seemed meaningless now. Each swing of the pickaxe rang hollow, echoing in tunnels that felt narrower by the day. Jesper no longer cooked. His stores had run low weeks ago, and whatever meager rabbits or squirrels the hunters brought back were found mutilated on the thresholds come dawn, torn open and arranged in grotesque shapes that no one dared interpret. Instead, the men chewed stale crusts of bread, sucked on pebbles to stave off thirst, and tried not to look too closely at the dark stains spreading across the floorboards. Sometimes they would find lumps of black mold growing on the walls. Thick, ropish strands that smelled of damp graves. Jesper burned them with heated shovels, muttering fevered prayers, but they always returned by morning, larger, reaching higher up the timber. It was around this time that voices began speaking back. It happened first to old Micah, who'd survived 2 cave-ins and a knife fight back in Dodge. He was found crouched in the corner of the dining hall, head cocked as if listening to someone whisper just behind his ear. When Jesper tried to lead him away, Micah hissed, eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. "They're hungry," he croaked. "Hungry for laughter, for stories. They're tired of waiting." He died that night, curled up on the hearth like a dog, a faint smile on his lips. By morning, his body was little more than skin drawn tight over bones, the belly caved inward as if sucked empty from within. After Micah, others began hearing things too. Soft, cajoling voices that promised warmth, promised company, promised to fill that terrible hollow inside them if only they'd come to the table. Men would start awake in the middle of the night to find one of their fellows standing by the long table, hands resting on the back of a chair, lips moving soundlessly. When pulled away, they'd scream and thrash like cornered animals, eyes wide with terror, or was it longing? The knocks returned then, but no longer on the walls or doors. Now they came from beneath the floorboards. A patient, deliberate tapping that traveled from one end of the dining hall to the other, as if something below were feeling its way along the grain of the wood. Jesper lost what little composure he had left. One night, he piled up all the lanterns in the center of the room, smashed them with the butt of a rifle, and set the heap ablaze. Flames roared up, black smoke churning against the ceiling beams. The men dragged him away, but by then it was too late. The oil caught fast, licking up the walls, racing along cracks toward the roof. They managed to stamp out most of it, but not before one entire corner of the hall was scorched to charcoal, the wood still steaming days later. That night, no one dared close their eyes. The tapping beneath the floor turned to scraping, like claws dragging slowly through damp soil. and through the warped floorboards, they swore they could see something pulse, a faint red glow, beating in time with their own ragged breath. By dawn, 5 men had fled into the forest, packs thrown over their shoulders, rifles clutched in shaking hands. They left without farewells, without backward glances. Jesper watched them disappear into the trees, his face a mask of resignation. "They won't make it a mile," he said flatly. No one argued. And indeed, 3 days later the forest returned them. Or parts of them. Bits of clothing snagged on brambles, a boot still containing most of a foot, a tangle of hair clotted with dark fluid. The forest floor was churned up in places, marked by long gouges that didn't match any claw or paw Jesper could name. By now, even the most skeptical miners accepted that they were trapped, whether by hunger, by fear, or by something older and crueler that lived beneath Miller's Ridge. Some stopped speaking entirely. They sat in corners or leaned against doorframes, eyes glassy, lips moving in soundless prayer. Others paced the hall like caged animals, fingers drumming compulsively against their thighs, heads jerking every time the wind shifted. And through it all, the long table stood patiently at the center of it all, always cleaned somehow, always set again by unseen hands. 13 places. Plates polished, forks aligned, cups waiting to be filled. It became a kind of obscene gravity. No matter where a man sat or slept, his eyes inevitably drifted back to that table, drawn by some morbid fascination. Then one evening, with the sun setting in a wash of bloody red beyond the pines, one of them finally gave in. It was Lem Parker, a thick-set man who used to sing bawdy songs and brag about the girls he'd left behind in Sacramento. Jesper found him seated at the table, knife and fork in hand, staring down at a plate piled high with steaming meat. Where it had come from, Jesper didn't want to guess. Lem's mouth twitched, saliva glistening at the corners of his lips. When Jesper grabbed his shoulders to pull him away, Lem growled, an animal noise low and vibrating through his chest. "Don't you smell it?" Lem rasped. "It's so sweet, so warm." Then he brought the fork to his mouth. Jesper tried to stop him, but Lem's strength was monstrous. He shoved the cook back with a single heave and began to eat, tearing at the meat with greedy bites, gulping it down so quickly that bits of it dribbled from his chin to the floor. His eyes rolled back and a shudder passed through his entire body, like a man taking his first drink after weeks in the desert. When he was done, he slumped forward, face buried in the plate, a wet gurgle escaping his throat. Jesper crept closer and found Lem's mouth still working, chewing on nothing at all, eyes fluttering behind thin lids. He died there, face down in whatever nightmare feast he'd devoured, a faint smile stretched across his lips. No one moved his body. By the next morning, it had shriveled to a husk, the skin darkened and brittle, pulling away from the bones as if scorched from within. After that, the men understood the truth, or what passed for truth in a place like Miller's Ridge. The table wasn't waiting for them to starve. It was patient because it knew hunger was inevitable. Sooner or later, each of them would be drawn to it. And once they tasted whatever lay steaming on those plates, there would be no turning back. Jesper boarded up the doors then. He hammered planks across the windows, smeared ash and blood and crude symbols above the lintels. The dining hall became a tomb, holding them all inside with their fear and their dwindling sanity. Outside, the forest watched, silent and waiting. And below, something moved. Always moving. Clawing, creeping, whispering through the veins of the old mine shafts, sending up faint tremors that rattled the silverware on the table. As if it too was growing restless. The barricaded dining hall took on a stench of sweat, mildew and slow rot. With every breath, the miners tasted something sour at the back of their throats, like old copper coins held too long on the tongue. No one bathed anymore. Water was rationed, firewood ran low, and no one dared venture beyond the thresholds after dusk. The once solid men of Miller's Ridge shrank into twitchy wraiths, sunken eyes darting between door, window, and that damned long table which still waited patiently at the center of their world. Jesper kept watch by the cold hearth, shotgun laid across his knees. He hadn't slept in days. Dark crescents bloomed beneath his eyes, and his skin was beginning to flake at the edges. Sometimes his hands twitched as if conducting some invisible orchestra, replaying a memory he couldn't shake. Whenever he caught one of the men staring too long at the table, he'd bark their name, sharp and sudden, just to see them flinch. As if breaking that thin thread might keep them tethered a little longer. But each day the whispers grew louder. It was as if the very walls had learned to breathe. At night, they expanded and contracted with soft sighs that carried words none of them understood. Sometimes Jesper would look up to find black mold blooming in intricate spirals across the planks, shapes that reminded him of coiled worms or eyes opening to watch him. He burned them when he could, but the patterns always returned, more elaborate each time. Then came the bruises. First on the arms of Eli Hart, a big man who once joked he could drink any two miners under the table. Pale blue marks ringed his biceps as if grasped by hands too large to belong to any living man. Next it was Victor Dunn, who awoke screaming, clawing at his throat where dark fingerprints bloomed like ink beneath his skin. Soon nearly all of them bore these marks, blooms of shadow under their shirts, along ribs at the base of their necks, signs of embraces that happened in sleep, or perhaps while they stood paralyzed in daylight, staring at the table with vacant eyes. One dawn, after a night of strange rustling beneath the floorboards, Jesper found the plates had been reset. This time there were only 12. One place stood empty, chair tipped slightly as though someone had just risen. At the far end, a goblet brimming with some dark liquid sat waiting. The smell rising from it was sweet, nearly intoxicating. Even Jesper swayed a little before tearing his gaze away. "Count us," he hissed, grabbing the nearest miner by the collar. "Count us now." They did. 11 men left. Somewhere in the night, without so much as a groan or a rustle of blankets, Eli Hart had vanished. His bedroll was still warm. His boots were gone. But of Eli himself, not even a hair. That day the walls wept. From the seams between the planks, thin rivulets of black moisture trickled down, pooling on the floor in sluggish little lakes. It smelled like rot, like iron, like old wounds left to fester. Jesper tried to mop it up, but the rags he used came away reeking and slick, leaving behind faint stains that pulsed under the lantern light. They stopped eating altogether. Jesper locked up the remaining sacks of flour and dried beans in a chest under his cot, though he doubted it mattered anymore. None of them had the stomach to eat. Their bellies were tight, skin stretched as if stuffed full already by something that needed no food. The dreams grew cruel. Not just visions of the table now, but of things rising from the mines below, vast shapes that scraped along tunnels too narrow for them, trailing limbs like drowned weeds. And voices that no longer pleaded or promised. Now they commanded. "Come sit. Come join. You've earned your place." Jesper would bolt upright each time, mouth open on a scream that wouldn't come, throat too raw and dry. Around him, the other men jerked and twitched in their sleep, lips moving as if chewing. Then one evening, as dusk stained the sky a deep, funeral purple, the floorboards beneath the long table split. It was not sudden, not a thunderous crack. Rather it opened like a slow grin, wood bending impossibly without shattering, seams stretching wide to reveal a darkness below that was thick and almost fluid. From it rose a smell of warm meat and rust, of fresh graves overturned. Shapes shifted just beyond sight, disturbing the dark as if great pale fish swam under still water. The miners gathered in a trembling clutch against the far wall. Jesper raised his shotgun, though he knew in his heart it was useless. His hands shook so badly the barrel wavered from the door to the floor to the table and back again. Slowly one of the chairs scraped backward, moved by hands no one could see. It turned slightly inviting. Then another. And another, until all 12 were pulled out from the table, angled toward the terrified men. The whispers rose then, filling the hall so completely they seemed to press on the eardrums, seeping into the sinuses, vibrating in the very marrow. Words in no language Jesper knew, but heavy with meaning all the same. Words that clawed at his will, tearing tiny rents in whatever defenses he had left. Victor Dunn was the first to step forward. Jesper tried to grab him, but Victor shrugged off his hand like cobwebs, eyes wide and shining with tears. He walked to the nearest chair and sat heavily, hands smoothing down his filthy shirt as though to make himself presentable. The chair pulled itself in under him with a sick little jerk. Then the next man went. And another. Until only Jesper stood alone at the far wall, shotgun aimed with trembling arms at the last empty seat. "No," he croaked. "Not me. Not mine." But the shotgun grew heavy, impossibly heavy, until it clattered to the ground. His legs buckled. Tears ran hot down his cheeks. Some part of him still screamed to run, to fight, to claw his way through the boarded windows and hurl himself into the woods. But his feet moved of their own accord. He approached the table. Saw that each plate before his companions was now piled high with steaming cuts of something dark and glistening. They bent their heads and ate greedily, hands shaking with eagerness. Blood ran down their chins. Their eyes never left the table. Jesper's chair awaited him. It was the one at the head, directly across from the yawning crack in the floorboards. The smell rising from that dark mouth was sweet now, unbearably so, like the syrupy rot of fallen fruit. His knees hit the seat before he realized he'd moved. The chair slid in close, tight against his thighs. A plate appeared before him, piled high. A knife and fork rested to either side, gleaming. Beside it, a goblet waited, filled to the brim with that same dark, swirling liquid. He didn't want to reach out. God knew he didn't. But his hands moved anyway, trembling as they picked up the fork, speared a steaming piece of meat, brought it to his mouth. The first bite was agony. It seared down his throat like swallowing coals. His vision went white. Then, bliss. Warmth radiated from his gut outward, flooding frozen veins, loosening clenched muscles. He sobbed as he chewed, tears splashing onto the plate. All around him, the others moaned in ecstasy, mouths working, gullets swallowing, hands clawing at the plates for more. From below the floor came a deep, contented sigh, like a vast creature settling into sleep. When Jesper's goblet lifted itself to his lips, he did not resist. The liquid was hot, metallic, thick enough to coat his tongue. It filled him in a way no stew ever could, spreading to every aching corner of him. As he drained the last of it, his eyes drifted down into the split boards at his feet. Something vast shifted in the dark there, pale shapes rolling over one another, countless eyes blinking open to regard him. And then he smiled. Because for the first time in months, the hunger was gone. It was nearly 30 years later, in the early spring of 1910, when men once again climbed the slopes of Miller's Ridge. They weren't miners this time, but a small survey team sent by the railroad, led by a man named Amos Ballard. The company planned to run a spur line through the Oregon highlands, seeking the most stable routes over old forest and beneath brittle peaks. Ballard was a plain man, small, neat, fond of ledgers and measurements, who cared little for ghost stories. He had heard a few whispered tales in the nearest town about the cursed ridge, but dismissed them with the dry pragmatism of a man who trusted more in maps and compasses than in folklore. It was mid-morning when they broke through a thick stand of pine and found the remnants of the camp. Time had not been kind. Most of the cabins had collapsed in on themselves, roofs caved under decades of heavy snows. Only the dining hall still stood mostly intact, leaning drunkenly, one corner scorched black from some old fire. The ground around it was oddly barren, as if nothing had dared to grow there all these years. Ballard's men joked nervously as they explored, kicking aside scraps of old tools, rusted cans, half-buried bits of clothing moldering into the soil. A few made the sign of the cross when they spotted strange spiral markings carved into tree trunks or clusters of stones stacked in triplets at the forest's edge. Ballard merely scoffed, snapping quick notations in his journal. But when they stepped into the dining hall, the laughter died. A heavy, cold stillness met them inside, thick as a wool blanket. Dust lay over everything in a dense pall, disturbed only by their cautious footsteps. Cobwebs draped from rafter to rafter like old funeral veils. The air was damp, musty, and underneath it all lay a faint sweetness, like overripe fruit left to rot in the dark. At first glance, the long table appeared perfectly ordinary, if choked by dust. Then Ballard noticed the chairs. All 13 were pulled neatly into place, tucked with eerie precision. Each place setting weighted just so. Tarnished forks laid alongside cracked plates, goblets crusted with the residue of something dark long evaporated. Strange hospitality, one of the crew muttered. Another nudged Ballard, pointing with a trembling finger. Along the far wall, carved deep into the timber in looping, half-mad scrawls, ran a single repeated phrase. "We fed them. Now they feed us." It ran on and on, overlapping itself, gouged so furiously into the wood that splinters curled outward like grasping fingers. Beneath the words, small black rivulets stained the wall, old seepage from cracks or something far older that had never fully dried. Ballard cleared his throat, trying to steady his voice. "Nothing but the ramblings of starving men," he announced. But it sounded hollow even to him. They were about to leave when one of the crew pried open a warped hatch near the far end of the hall. It had likely led to a cellar, a place to store winter goods, salted meats, sacks of flour. The door groaned, exhaling a damp, fetid breath as stale air wafted out. Lantern light revealed a narrow staircase descending into blackness. Ballard felt a chill spider down his spine. Logic warred with something older inside him, a primal warning that screamed to seal the hatch and walk away. But pride, or perhaps that same old arrogance that had driven the first miners, pushed him onward. He led the way down. The cellar was larger than expected. Rows of old barrels stood along the walls, some burst and spilling ancient straw. But it was the floor that arrested them. A great crack split the center of the packed earth, a jagged wound that descended who knew how deep. Around its edges, the soil was stained dark, and faint moldy growths formed ringlets that seemed almost deliberate. Ballard knelt to inspect it, lantern held low. That was when he noticed the claw marks, deep grooves raked into the earth leading both toward and away from the split. As if something had dragged itself from the hole. Or many somethings. A noise rose then from deep below. A long exhalation, wet and resonant, almost a sigh. The lantern flickered. Dust trembled from the ceiling. Somewhere behind them, a chair scraped faintly across the floorboards above. They fled. Stumbled up the stairs in a knot of jostling shoulders and panicked breaths, bursting into the gray daylight with lungs sucking greedily at the cold, piney air. No one spoke as they gathered their packs and began the long descent back toward town. Even Ballard, who tried to busy himself with muttered measurements, kept glancing over his shoulder. That night they camped at the base of the ridge. Few slept. Some claimed they heard faint laughter echoing down through the trees, a brittle, hungry sound. Others swore they saw shapes moving between the trunks, tall, impossibly thin figures whose limbs bent wrong, pausing to watch before melting back into shadow. Ballard sat up by the dying fire, journal forgotten, hands wringing his hat into a twisted knot. When one of his men asked what he thought they'd found up there, he didn't answer for a long time. Finally, voice little more than a scrape, he murmured, "A debt being paid." By morning they packed in silence and left Miller's Ridge behind, vowing never to return. But the story did not end there. Within months, rumors spread through nearby towns. Hunters spoke of strange tracks found in fresh mud, long three-toed impressions that sank far deeper than any human footprint. Loggers whispered of old cabins discovered in the woods, doors torn from hinges, inside littered with small neatly stacked piles of stones capped by lumps of rotten meat. Sometimes at dusk, locals claimed, they could see the faint outline of a long wooden table standing amid the trees, set for a feast that never truly ended. The legend of Miller's Ridge did not stay locked within that rotting dining hall. Over the decades that followed, pieces of its grim puzzle surfaced in the most unexpected places. Snippets of old letters, confessions scrawled in brittle journals, accounts overheard in dim saloons by men too afraid to speak them above a whisper. In 1913, 3 years after Ballard's survey team fled the ridge, a trapper named Josiah Wainwright sent a letter to his sister in Montana. It was found decades later, folded inside a Bible at the bottom of a cedar chest. The paper was stained with sweat and something darker that had eaten tiny holes through entire paragraphs. What remained was enough to chill any reader. "Dearest Mary, I know what folks say about me. That I've been too long in these woods, too much alone with my own thoughts. Maybe they're right. But last week I came across something I ain't ever hoped to see again after what I glimpsed on Miller's Ridge. There was a stand of pines all dead and gray and right in the middle, a table. Not just planks nailed together, but a real table long and set proper with chairs all around. Plates on it too with scraps of something black that moved when I looked too close. I didn't stay. I ain't no fool. Only, every night since I dream of sitting there. Always at the head. Always with folks I recognize but can't quite name. And when I wake, my belly hurts like it's empty all over again no matter what I put in it. Pray for me, Mary. Your brother, Josiah." The letter ended there, no follow-up ever found. The county clerk's ledgers listed Josiah as missing by winter's end. Locals claimed they saw lights flickering in the woods near Miller's Ridge around the same time, like lanterns swaying, though no one dared go check. Then there were the children. In 1926, a schoolteacher in Pendleton recorded an unsettling incident in her daily logbook. It was a thin volume, mostly notes on attendance and discipline, but wedged between routine complaints about tardy boys and ink-stained skirts was this trembling script. Today 4 of the younger boys claimed they'd seen a long table in the trees while hunting rabbits by Miller's Trail. They said there were people sitting there who kept turning to look at them, even though their heads never moved. When I pressed them, they wept and refused to speak further. I have warned all the families to keep their children close. Over the years, more rumors filtered down from those hills. A logger spoke of finding small piles of stones outside his cabin each morning, 3 stones always stacked the same way, capped by something that looked like dried liver. Another swore he saw someone standing at the edge of his campfire light, impossibly tall, skin the color of old candle wax. When he blinked, it was gone. By 1942, the story of Miller's Ridge had metastasized into local folklore. Hunters carried iron charms in their pockets, muttering that it would keep them that feast away. Children dared each other to run up the old logging trail and knock on the trees 3 times, a game that sometimes ended in tears and frantic dashes back to town. But the most disturbing evidence came from an unlikely place. In 1957, during a renovation of the county records building, a dusty safe was cracked open after decades of disuse. Inside lay stacks of property deeds, marriage licenses, and a slim, cloth-bound diary tied shut with a leather thong. The first pages were mundane enough, penned by a miner named Ephraim Tully in 1879. He wrote of travel delays, of men grumbling over thin stew, of hopes for a rich strike that would carry them all back east as kings. But near the end the entries shifted. The handwriting grew jagged, letters slanting wildly across the page. March 3rd. Jesper says the table's set again. I ain't seen it but I believe him. March 5th. Victor laughs in his sleep. Woke up with blood on his hands. Says he can't remember why. March 7th. They wait below. I hear them whisper to each other. Not to me. Not yet. March 8th. Dreams of a long feast. I'm always at the head. Always carving meat I can't name. They applaud without faces. The final entry was nothing but a single phrase written over and over, filling 2 entire pages. I am so hungry. I am so hungry. I am so hungry. The diary ended there. Its last pages were stuck together with a dark residue that archivists later refused to test. Decades blurred into one long hush. The ridge remained largely untouched. No new claims, no lumber operations, no roads built. Even the railway company that first sent Ballard quietly rerouted their lines, citing unstable geological conditions, though old engineers' memos hinted at complaints of workers going missing. Yet every few years someone wandered close. A hunter chasing deer deeper than intended. A pair of boys seeking a secret place to share stolen cigarettes. Sometimes they returned pale and tight-lipped, shivering even on warm days. Sometimes they didn't return at all. One local pastor, Father Callahan, claimed to have driven up near the ridge in 1968 to look for 2 parish teenagers gone missing. He later told his congregation, voice cracking in the pulpit, that he saw a hall standing proud among the pines, lights glowing through its cracked windows though no smoke rose from the chimney. He said he heard laughter drifting down the slopes, low, content, mingled with the scrape of cutlery. When asked why he hadn't gone in to search, Callahan only shook his head. I knew if I crossed that threshold I wouldn't be coming back either. And not just my body, my very soul would stay seated at that table forever. After that sermon he was never quite the same. Parishioners found him some weeks later in the confessional, mumbling about black dust and empty bellies, rocking back and forth with rosary clutched so tight his knuckles split and bled. All these fragments, the letter from Josiah, the teacher's log, Tully's diary, Callahan's sermon, wove themselves into a tapestry of dread. Together they painted a picture that was never quite complete, always just a little out of focus like something glimpsed through warped glass. And yet certain patterns emerged. Always a long table. Always places set with more care than any starving miner or lonely hunter could have mustered. Always laughter that never warmed the heart, only clawed at it. Always a hunger that no earthly food could touch. So Miller's Ridge lingered in the edges of Oregon's memory, a ghost place. A place avoided on maps, left blank by even the most meticulous cartographers. Locals grew to simply not speak of it at all, letting silence serve where warnings failed. Because in the dark of their deepest fears, they all knew the same thing. That table still waited up there, chairs angled out in invitation, plates clean and ready. And someday someone new would come hungry enough to sit down. It was in the damp chill of May 1910, after long weeks of mapping the Oregon highlands, that Amos Ballard and his survey team returned to Miller's Ridge. They didn't intend to. The plan had been to swing wide east and avoid the shadowed pines locals muttered about. But a rockslide blocked their intended path, forcing them up an older logging trail that twisted inevitably toward that cursed rise. Their horses balked long before the camp came into view, rolling their eyes and stamping until the men tethered them well away. Ballard scoffed at this, though even he found himself whispering a little prayer under his breath as they set off on foot. Fog lay thick across the ridge. It clung to the trees in ropes, muffling footsteps and bending distance strangely. The men found themselves brushing shoulders though they'd swear they walked with yards between them. Their voices sounded flat, swallowed by a silence that felt almost expectant. When at last the dining hall loomed out of the mist, Ballard felt his breath catch. Time had barely touched the structure since they first stumbled on it weeks ago. The same scorched corner, the same sagging roof. And inside, the same heavy hush that seemed to press on their eardrums. Only this time it was different. Because this time the long table was not empty. 13 men sat around it, chairs pulled in tight, heads bowed slightly as if listening to some soft joke that never quite reached anyone else's ears. Plates sat before them, piled high with some dark, steaming meat that filled the hall with a sweetness that turned Ballard's stomach. Forks lay neatly atop napkins, knives gleamed with fresh residue. For a moment, none of Ballard's crew could move. Their lanterns threw long, jittering shadows across the walls, catching on mold that curled in delicate spirals, on carvings dug deep by desperate hands. Then one of the miners at the table looked up. His face was drawn tight over high cheekbones, skin gray and slick as if waxed. His eyes were dark sockets, bottomless pits that seemed to drink in the lantern light without ever giving it back. His mouth twitched, almost a smile, and a soft wet breath wheezed from between cracked lips. As if that was permission, the others began to move too. Slow dragging motions, heads turning, fingers flexing on table edges. One raised his goblet slightly, a thin trickle of black liquid spilling down the side to patter on the wood below. Ballard staggered back. His men broke into shouts, some fumbling for revolvers they barely managed to draw. A shot rang out, deafening in the close space, blasting a chunk from the far wall. The figures at the table did not flinch. They only continued their slow, grotesque motions, chewing, swallowing, raising utensils to mouths that gaped wider than they should have been able to. And then came the smell. It was as if the floorboards exhaled all at once, a deep, fetid breath that rolled up from beneath, carrying the scent of iron, spoiled marrow, old earth. The boards under the table bowed outward, flexing as something huge stirred just below, sending tiny motes of black dust swirling up into the lantern glow. Ballard tried to shout an order to run, but it came out a choked gasp. He backed away, boots slipping on the gritty floor, nearly colliding with one of his own men who stood frozen, eyes locked on the table. The man's mouth hung open, trembling slightly, drool beginning to trickle down his chin. "Jackson. Move, damn you." Ballard rasped, grabbing the surveyor by the shoulders. But Jackson did not blink. His eyes had gone glassy, pupils blown wide. He gave a tiny, hungry whimper, then wrenched himself free and stumbled forward. They watched in horror as Jackson stepped to the head of the table, the same place once occupied by a man named Jesper decades ago, and sat down heavily. A plate appeared before him, piled high with steaming cuts of something that pulsed faintly as if still alive. His hands shook as he picked up a fork. Ballard didn't wait to see more. He turned and fled, crashing through the warped door, nearly tearing it from its hinges. Behind him, the dining hall exploded in a chorus of sighs and wet, eager laughter. Outside, fog swallowed everything. Shapes moved within it, tall, thin shapes whose limbs bent oddly, pacing just beyond reach. Ballard ran blind, arms raised to shield his face from branches that seemed to claw at him. He did not stop until he blundered into the clearing where they'd left the horses. Two of his crew tumbled out behind him moments later, eyes wild. They didn't speak. Couldn't. Together they hauled themselves onto their mounts and tore down the trail, not daring to look back. When Ballard finally returned to Pendleton, he tried to report what they'd found. Tried to explain the table, the miners who should have long since turned to dust, the smell of fresh blood in a place abandoned for decades. The company doctor wrote him up as distressed from prolonged exposure and malnutrition, sending him on indefinite leave. Two of his men signed on to work in Idaho within the month, never to be seen again. The third was found weeks later wandering a riverside dock, muttering about the feast that never ends, eyes rolling like a frightened horse. Ballard himself retired to a small house outside Eugene. Locals remembered him as a thin man who took long walks at dusk, always with a rosary tangled in his hands. Sometimes he'd startle at the sight of crows, clutching his chest as if shot. When he finally died in 1922, they found dozens of scraps of paper pinned all over the walls of his bedroom, each covered in looping script repeating the same phrase. "It waits at the table. It waits at the table. It waits at the table." Years rolled by. Miller's Ridge sank deeper into its legend, but that did not keep the curious away forever. Hikers. Thrill seekers. A group of college students who pitched tents too close to the old hall one October night, only for their campsite to be found days later. Tents collapsed, belongings scattered, not a footprint to mark where they'd gone. And always the same rumors. That if you stand very still in the woods as twilight bleeds away, you'll hear the faint clink of forks on plates. That sometimes shapes sit at a table that shouldn't be there, raising goblets in silent toasts, waiting patiently for the next guest to arrive. Miller's Ridge became a ghost not only of itself, but of every hunger ever left unfulfilled. A place where debts were paid in courses and courses of flesh, where men's souls were ground down under the weight of promises whispered in the dark. And deep beneath the rotting hall, beyond old mine shafts that no longer led anywhere, something vast and slow turned in its sleep. It did not hunger in the way mortal creatures did. Its appetite was older, wider, a need for company, for stories, for the slow unfurling of dread that ripened men to their fullest flavor. Above it, the dining hall stood eternal. The table remained set. The chairs remained pulled out, angled in quiet invitation. Plates waited to be filled. Goblets waited to be raised. And somewhere, far away, another traveler felt the first hollow tug in his gut. A small emptiness that would grow day by day, twisting itself into dreams of dark feasts, until at last he would find his feet carrying him up a forgotten trail, through pines that seemed to whisper his name. Until at last he would sit, fork trembling in hand, and learn just how deep the hunger could go. They say places remember. That long after the last voice has fallen silent, after footsteps fade and laughter rots in the walls, something lingers. The shape of sounds. The taste of old grief. The echo of stories that refuse to be buried. Miller's Ridge remembers. Even now, if you stand at the edge of the tree line, you can see the dining hall hunching there among the pines, weathered boards sagging, windows opaque with grime. From a distance it seems little more than a ruin, another ghost of the gold rush swallowed by moss and time. But come closer and you'll notice things. How the air grows heavy, pressing on your shoulders as if to urge you back. How no birds sing near the hall, and even the insects fall silent. How the earth itself feels hollow beneath your boots, vibrating faintly, a pulse that might be the echo of your own heart or something far deeper. Push open the warped door and step inside if you dare. The smell hits first, a sweetness that is not welcoming but cloying, sickly. Dust hangs thick as old curtains. Your lantern will struggle to pierce it, the light seeming to cower close to the flame. And then there's the table. Still long. Still set. Still 13 places, each with its own tarnished fork, each goblet waiting to be raised. Plates lie empty now or nearly so, faint smears of something dark and long-dried cling to their centers. Chairs stand politely pulled back, angled just so, an invitation that needs no words. Move closer and you might swear the chairs twitch slightly eager. That if you look away even for a heartbeat, they'll have drawn a touch nearer, as if hoping you'll take your place without fuss. On the far wall, above the old hearth, faint words can still be made out. Gouged so deep into the wood that time itself couldn't quite erase them. We fed them. Now they feed us. Run your fingers across the grooves, feel the splinters catch your skin. Notice how they come away damp as if the wood weeps even now. It said the hall never truly empties. That if you stand still long enough, you'll begin to hear them. Soft murmurs drifting from nowhere, bits of conversation that break into gentle laughter. The scrape of cutlery. The hollow clink of goblets meeting in silent toasts. And sometimes, if the fog is thick and the night breathes right against the window panes, you might see them. Figures seated all along the table, pale faces turned toward one another, mouths opening in joyless mirth. Hands move, cutting, lifting, feeding. At the head sits a man you won't recognize, but in your bones you'll know him all the same. His eyes will meet yours, hollow and dark, and he'll incline his head just slightly, as if to say, there's room for one more. If your hunger is strong enough, if that deep aching emptiness has taken root in you, you might step forward. Find yourself sliding into the nearest chair, hands reaching of their own accord for the waiting fork. And should you take that first bite, warm and slick on your tongue, bursting against your teeth with a taste at once foreign and achingly familiar, you'll understand. Understand why those who came before stayed. Why they fed. Why the laughter never quite stops. Because hunger is older than any curse. Older than greed or grief or even gold. It's a promise etched into the marrow of all who walk upright and dream by firelight. A promise that one day you'll feast too. So the ridge remains. The dining hall stands. The table waits. And out there, in small towns and sprawling cities, men and women sleep fitfully, clutching their bellies against a hollowness they can't name. They wake from dreams of pine-shadowed hills and long wooden tables set for 13, lips wet with longing they cannot explain. Someday one of them will follow that pull. Find themselves at Miller's Ridge. Step across a threshold that remembers every footfall, every sob, every sigh of delight. And somewhere deep below, something vast and patient will stir from its slumber. Stretch. Smile. Because the feast, after all, is forever. Fragments from the world. Excerpt from a Reddit post in /paranormal truths, dated July 2014. /Cascade Tomcat. So my uncle used to work forestry out in Oregon in the 80s, and he swore there was this place his crew wouldn't go near. Said they found these little stacks of rocks and threes all over the ridgeline. Sometimes with bits of dark meat or feathers on top. He thought it was some kind of native ritual at first, until he saw one of the piles move. Like actually shift, stones toppling by themselves. He told me he once heard laughing from up the slope, like a dinner party or something, even though it was almost dark and there were no lights. I thought he was just messing with me till I had my own weird trip up near there. Long story? Stay the hell away from Miller's Ridge. Not worth it. Partial email recovered from a missing hiker's laptop. Timestamped August 12, 2016. Subject: weird shit on the trail. Hey Bree. You'd laugh at me, but today I found this old building in the woods. Totally out of nowhere. Like we've been following a GPS route, no reason for a damn cabin or hall to be there. Looked abandoned but felt wrong. Like the air got thick. Could swear I heard forks clinking like a fancy restaurant. Didn't go in. Just left. Funny thing, later I couldn't stop thinking about it. Like craving something but not food. Anyway, see you in a few days. Miss your face. Handwritten note found tucked into a library book on Oregon folklore, Portland State University 2022. If you find the table, don't sit. Don't even look at the plates. I'm still hungry. I shouldn't be, but I am. Please burn this. Audio transcript from a local sheriff's dashcam report, Jackson County 2020. Checked out a call about lights up on Miller's Ridge. Teenagers maybe. Found 3 cars at the trailhead, all empty. Doors wide open, one engine still running. Hiked up a bit. Heard voices, laughing, talking, clear as day. Could smell. Christ, it smelled like stew. Didn't find anyone. Going back with more deputies tomorrow. Camping, a more recent tale, 2019. It was late September of 2019 when 4 college students from Boise decided to hike into Oregon for the weekend. They were typical thrill seekers with overpriced hiking gear and an Instagram page to document every sweaty mile. They'd read about spooky ghost towns and abandoned mining camps, chasing hashtags more than actual history. They didn't mean to find Miller's Ridge. It was dusk when they realized the trail they'd plotted had somehow curved them miles off the Forest Service maps. The sun dipped low, turning the sky molten orange, and one of them, a girl named Lena, started complaining of feeling sick. Said her stomach felt hollow and cramping. Her boyfriend Dan joked it was just the burritos they'd grabbed before the drive. Then, through the trees, they spotted it. A long, low building of gray wood, half swallowed by moss. Broken windows glared darkly back at them. The door hung slightly ajar. Lena insisted she heard music coming from inside, soft, tinkling notes like someone playing glasses with wet fingers. They argued about going closer. 2 wanted to leave right then, but Dan pushed ahead, laughing, calling them babies. He swore they'd take a few creepy pictures for their feed and get out. Inside, the hall was cold, even compared to the chilly evening. Dust blanketed the floor so thick their footprints left deep troughs. But the table, God, the table was spotless. Plates gleamed in the dying light. Goblets caught the last sunbeams and glittered. Chairs stood pushed out slightly as if waiting for them. Lena started crying. Said she felt like she'd just walked in on something private, something that noticed her noticing. But Dan only grinned, sat himself in the nearest chair and posed with 2 fingers up in a peace sign. The camera flash went off, painfully bright. The others flinched, the light leaving ghost images dancing across their retinas. Then came the smell. Sweet. Thick. Like roasted meat left too long. And under it, something sharp, metallic. Lena gagged, pressing her hands over her mouth. The table seemed to breathe. The plates steamed faintly, fogging the air above them. One of the others, Max, began to reach forward, hand trembling, eyes wide. Lena grabbed him, yanked him back. Don't. Please don't. A scraping sound echoed through the hall. The chairs slid closer to the table, the way hungry dogs crowd a bowl. That broke them. They fled, stumbling out into the dark, not bothering to grab packs or lights. They ran for hours, tripping over roots, tearing their clothes, until finally they burst onto an old service road where they flagged down a baffled truck driver. Weeks later, Lena posted the picture Dan had snapped, half in defiance, half to prove it had all happened. You can still find it if you dig through old Instagram archives. It shows Dan sitting at the head of the table, smiling. But if you look closely, really closely, you'll see shadows behind him that don't match any of the others in the room. Long shadows. Too many hands resting on chair backs. Faces that are nothing but hungry voids. Dan hasn't been seen since early 2020. His friends say he started talking about going back, that he couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, felt an emptiness clawing at him. Last message he sent to Lena simply read, "I think I'll just take a quick hike. I keep dreaming there's a place already set for me." Writing hand, final breath. So Miller's Ridge waits. It waits for those who feel a little too hollow. For those who wake at night with their bellies gnawing at them, who dream of long tables and gentle laughter just out of sight. And somewhere beneath that dining hall, something vast stirs again. Smiling. Patient. Because sooner or later, the hungry always find their way home. Final whisper. And maybe tonight, after all this talk of dark halls and endless feasts, you'll lie in bed and feel it, that small twist in your gut, that hollow twinge you'll try to blame on nerves or too little dinner. Maybe you'll dream of pine forests, fog curling low around your ankles, of a warm golden glow just beyond the trees. You'll hear laughter. The clink of cutlery. Your name spoken softly by voices you almost recognize. When you wake, you might laugh it off. Brush it away. But if, over the coming nights, that hunger grows, if you find yourself staring at your dinner plate with disappointment, wondering why it never quite fills you, remember this story. Remember Miller's Ridge. Because that's how it always starts. With a small ache. A quiet craving. A single step off the safe trail. Until at last you'll find yourself standing before that old hall, hand on the warped door, breath catching as you push it open and see the table waiting. 13 chairs. And one of them pulled out just for you.